So the last part here of the radio PowerPoint is going to be a discussion of issues and controversies related to radio and its development and its content, primarily about content. Radio has, like other media, radio has situations and issues that it has gone through and goes through that need to be resolved in one way or another. Of course, one of the things about radio is the question of content. Because the radio frequency spectrum is considered a public domain, the FCC has say over content and whether or not that content is acceptable, or it might be indecent, or might be considered obscene. With this, we're going to talk about, first off, we're going to talk about indecency. The indecency issue arose out of a playing of a particular routine that was devised by comedian George Carlin. George Carlin, some of you may be familiar with Carlin. He died about 6 years ago. Carlin began as a very conventional comedian in the late 50s. But he saw in the 60s, as the country was changing, as the world was changing, as young people were finding their voices, as they were challenging authority, particularly in the late 60s, challenging the war in Vietnam, challenging racism, challenging sexism. Carlin decided that he wanted to change along with young people. And so his comedy changed from much more conventional comedy to more controversial comedy. He is one of the best performers looking at evaluating, analyzing language and how we communicate with each other. And one of the routines that he had was one called 7 Words You Can Never Say on Television. The idea here was that the Federal Communication Commission and the National Association of Broadcasters has determined that there are certain words, and remember the time context here, this is in the 70s and 80s, there are certain words that, because television and radio are part of the public radio frequency spectrum, there are certain words that are just considered indecent and therefore should not be played in this public forum. Well, a radio station in New York City, a community supported radio station, played this routine from one of George Carlin's records on AM broadcast radio, making the point that they were going to talk about language and how some words are considered indecent or obscene and why others are not. And eventually what this did was it began a lawsuit that went to the Supreme Court to have the Supreme Court decide what is indecent. The station was WBAI in New York City. It was owned by Pacifica Broadcasting. The station played the routine, and as Carlin will point out, one person made one complaint out of a city of 25 million that the FCC determined was a legitimate complaint and tried to fine Pacifica Broadcasting, the owner of WBAI, and Pacifica said, no, we're not going to pay this because it was a free speech issue. And so eventually it went to the Supreme Court to determine whether or not indecent language can be considered free speech and under what circumstances.
in looking for these words, I kept finding new categories. We have so many ways of describing these dirty words. Well, we have more ways to describe dirty words than we actually have dirty words. That seems a little strange to me. It seems to indicate that somebody was awfully interested in these words. They kept referring to them. They called them bad words, dirty, filthy, foul, vile, vulgar, coarse, in poor taste, unseemly, street talk, gutter talk, locker room language, barracks talk, bawdy, naughty, saucy, raunchy, rude, crude, lewd, lascivious, indecent, profane, obscene, blue, off-color, risque, suggestive, cursing, cussing, swearing, and all I could think of was shit, piss, fuck, cunt, cocksucker, motherfucker, and tits. Shit, piss, fuck, cunt, cocksucker, motherfucker, and tits. That was my original list. I knew it wasn't complete, but it was a starter set, you know. Shit, piss, fuck. Yes, WBAI is the one who played them. Shit, piss, fuck, cunt, cocksucker, motherfucker, and tits. Now, that was the original list. We've added a few words since then. We've added fart, turd, and twat. And I know there are some other words that many of you are wondering about, why they haven't been considered, why they haven't shown up on the list thus far. We're looking at them all very closely. Some of your favorites might make the list this year.
Did you have any idea about the controversy that it would create?
Well, I must point out first, that was 1976. That was my second HBO show, and that was the routine came out on the record in 1973. And that was when the controversy, I guess it's an accurate word, began. 1973, it came out on the Class Clown album, and it was called 7 Words You Can Never Say on Television. The word never was important in that title, because there were words like bitch where you could refer to a dog. I mean, now you can say bitch in the human derogatory sense, but then you could at least say, well, it's dog, the bitch is here, and the male is here, and we're going to have babies. Bastard was okay, and certain words, you know, ass was a dunk. God wrote it. If Jesus rode into Jerusalem on an ass, that's fine. But you can't say, geez, he rode in on the ass. He was sitting on his ass on the ass. You couldn't say that. Some of the words have more than one meaning, and they'll give you one, they will take the other one away. It's interesting about those. I have a lot of thoughts on that that'll never probably see the light of day. But, oh yeah, the controversy. In 1973, WBAI, a listener-supported station in New York, a great one and a long-time champion of free speech, had a show in the afternoon called Lunchbox. What is it called? Lunchbox. I'm sorry now. I know the name of it, and it's just not coming right to me. Lunch Pail Review, Lunchbox Review, something of that nature. And they announced beforehand, we're going to play something you might not like. We're going to talk about why dirty language is considered dirty, and we're going to play this as an example. And it wasn't that routine, the first one, called 7 Words You Can Never Say on Television. It was the sequel on the next album called Filthy Words, where fart, turd, and twat were added to the list, and I explained things that you could say and you couldn't say. They played it, and a professional moralist, there are these professional moralists out there. I think it's called Morals in Media. If not, if it's another organization like that, at least you got a short plug, Morals in Media. He was in the car, this guy, with his son, and they didn't turn it off immediately. They listened to it, apparently unharmed by the experience. Neither of them showed up at the hospital or the mental clinics or anything. They listened without being harmed, and then they complained about it. The only complaint the FCC got in a market of what? Maybe 25 million, counting car radios and everything. One complaint, the FCC, it was a conservative panel at the time, and mostly always is. They sanctioned the station. The station said, no, we're going to court. The station won in district court in Washington, D.C. at the first level. They won 2-1 against the FCC, was overturned, and then they took it to the Supreme Court. The only comedian's routine ever to be involved in a Supreme Court case. This is a small amount of pride. The 9th grader loves knowing he's a footnote in American legal history. And the Supreme Court decided 5-4, fairly close still, that these words were indecent, not obscene, wasn't an obscenity case, but indecent, and the FCC was thereby empowered to regulate indecent language at given hours when they felt children might be listening. They did, by the way, the Supreme Court did not define the word child or children.
And when you think about this, this is, again, back in 1978 and in the 80s. It's rather quaint that when we look at the language that is considered indecent and how much of it is we find on broadcast and cable television and satellite television today. There's almost a suggestion that there really isn't, there aren't any restrictions as far as language is concerned, as far as indecent language for broadcast television, cable television, or satellite television nowadays.
In looking for these words, I kept finding new categories. We have so many ways of describing these dirty words.
What the Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court, found was that indeed the Federal Communications Commission did have the authority as the regulatory agency to determine what is indecent language in broadcast radio and broadcast television. As you may know, the Federal Communications Commission does not regulate content on cable because, again, people are paying subscriptions for that, or decent or satellite radio or satellite television. So they only regulate technical questions, but as far as content, the FCC has no authority, but it does have authority with respect to broadcast media. Then the second thing that they found is that there should be established in broadcast media a particular time when indecent language should not be used at all. Again, the idea is that children can potentially be exposed to indecent language during specific hours of the broadcast day. So networks and the National Association of Broadcasters basically set aside the time from 6 o'clock in the morning until 8 o'clock at night when no indecent language would be allowed. After that, after 8 o'clock at night, there was kind of a 2-hour period until 10 o'clock when some language that might be considered indecent would be allowed, and then there would be a little even more relaxed in hours after 10 o'clock at night on the broadcast day. But what's interesting here is that the Supreme Court weighed in on content with respect to decency. On the other hand, obscenity, the Supreme Court has basically said we're not even going to touch this. Content that might be considered obscene is determined by community and local standards, meaning that something that might be considered obscene in Eau Claire might not be considered obscene in Minneapolis, and vice versa. The Supreme Court has said that we're going to defer to local communities because local communities will have different standards as far as what might be considered obscene material, and therefore they should set those standards and enforce them on their own. This is really, interesting. The Supreme Court has been criticized for this because there are many who want to know where the lines are drawn, what kinds of materials can be considered obscene, and what is not obscene. And as we've kind of looked at in film, there might be a considered censorship in some of the decisions by the Motion Picture Association of America, but the Supreme Court just simply was not going to get involved in defining these sort of standards. Primarily, probably because they didn't want to set a limit on free speech. They would look at each individual case as it may have come before them, or they may decide not to look at it at all and let the local courts and the local standards stand. The second issue that we need to look at here is related to the Telecommunications Act of 1996, with respect specifically to ownership of broadcast stations and the awarding of licenses or the revocation of licenses. The Telecommunications Act of 1996 was a really broad omnibus kind of communications legislation. There were smaller laws, rules that were passed by Congress between 1934 and 1996, and they really kind of addressed specific issues. But the Telecommunications Act of 1996 was very broad, and particularly it had to do with the involvement of cable companies and telephone companies. But with respect to broadcast stations and their ownership and their licenses, there were two things that came out of the 1996 Act. With respect to ownership, the Telecommunications Act of 1996 relaxed the limit on the number of stations that could be owned by a person or a group. The Communications Act of 1934 set that limit at 7 AM and 7 FM stations, and as television became more prominent around the country, that number was added to this maximum number set in 1934. So eventually, one person or one group could own 7 AM, 7 FM, and 7 television stations for a maximum of 21. In 1985, that number was again expanded to 20 AM stations, 20 FM stations, and 12 television stations, making the maximum number of stations, broadcast stations, that could be owned by a person or a group at 52. Well, the 1996 Act just blew that all out of the water. They basically said, as far as radio is concerned, there is no limit to the number of radio stations that a group or person can own. So what this basically did was open up the sale and purchase of radio stations around the country, to the extent that there were some media companies that owned more than 1,000 radio stations. An example of this is a company that was known as Clear Channel. Today it's known as iHeartRadio. Owned more than 1,200 up to 1,400 radio stations around the country. By 2013, they had reduced that down to about 850. But the idea here is that the concern is you have one message going to a very large number of radio stations around the country. Consequently, there isn't a diversity of ideas. New and different ideas are not being expressed on the radio stations in varying markets around the country. An example of this is one group banned the playing of music by the Dixie Chicks back in 2003 because they had spoken out against President George W. Bush at one of their concerts, and there was considerable backlash by conservative public and conservative radio stations, and consequently an order was sent out that we're not going to play Dixie Chicks music anymore on these stations. So you can see the power that one group can have over the communications devices, the communication messages that are going out to tens of millions of people, and how it can be controlled by one entity. The effect of this, of course, is that programming is going to be centralized in large markets. A lot of smaller markets simply become automated. A lot of programming will originate in large markets like New York and Chicago and Los Angeles, and then smaller market radio stations simply become the repeaters of those programs, like in Eau Claire or in La Crosse or in Madison. You may be surprised that some of the programming that you listen to today on radio actually originates in large markets away from here. And consequently, they don't talk about things that are related to your own community. The other important concern here is that because these stations become automated, there are fewer employees there, and this can particularly affect coverage of local news topics and issues. Where there may have been a 2 or 3 employee news department, now there may not be any news department at all. Consequently, coverage of news issues, news topics related to that local community, where there had been coverage of them, there no longer is. And consequently, those who listen to this, the audience who listens to these corporate-owned radio stations, aren't getting the information that they need to participate in their communities. Then there is the issue of licenses, and this is really particularly difficult or particularly concerning, because the idea behind a license, and again, the idea that the electromagnetic wave spectrum was declared by Congress in 1927 to be a public resource. It's owned by the public. It is there for the public's necessity and convenience. And that any person or group that is awarded a license for a broadcast entity must serve the public first and foremost. And if that group or person does not serve the public, that they can have licenses taken away from them in their renewal after their initial years. The problem that was brought up in the Communications Act of 1996 is that broadcasters thought that the number of years, this revolving number of years, was too few. And so what they wanted was to increase that licensing period from 8 years, or from 5 years to 8 years, meaning that now, instead of having your license renewal coming up every 5 years, you would have a renewal every 8 years. So basically, it gives you another 2 to 3 years of broadcasting without having to worry about whether or not you are going to be reviewed as working in the public interest. But what's perhaps even more concerning is that in this renewal process, it used to be that organizations, entities within the community could challenge a renewal of a license of a broadcaster by saying this broadcaster is not working in the public interest and has been committing violations, and therefore the license should be awarded to somebody else who may be applying for it. Now, from 1996 on, there can be no competing applications in this review process unless it has been shown specifically that there has been disregard for the public interest and that the broadcaster has committed violations. So in other words, once you have a license as a broadcaster, you're going to have this license as long as this broadcast entity exists. There will be no challenge to you. And really, it's this kind of acquiescence to broadcasters by legislators that has really spurred that that feeling by broadcasters that I talked about previously, that they feel they own the licenses, or they own the frequencies now. There is no one else should be able to take these frequencies from them. They should be given control of these licenses in perpetuity, and that they no longer have to serve the public. They will serve the public to a certain extent, in that they want to continue to have an audience so that they can sell advertising. But as far as working in the public interest, they feel they don't need to do that. They don't have to fulfill the requirements by the Federal Communications Commission and by the law enforcement, by the legislation that has come down through the years, simply because in their eyes, they own the license, or they own the frequencies, and therefore this should be become a permanent ownership for them, so they can continue without having to renew anymore. So these are things that are related to the issues in radio, have been a part of radio and continue to be a part of radio. This is the last segment of this particular PowerPoint. If you have any questions about them, certainly communicate to me, and I will see if I can answer your questions as soon as possible.